Chief Justice John Roberts had heard thousands of arguments in his career, but on this day, something was different. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with anticipation, as Jasmine Crockett's words cut through the silence with a precision that felt almost surgical. Her voice was steady, her tone unshaken, and her eyes locked onto her opponent with a quiet fire that demanded respect. For a brief moment, the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath, and then it happened. Roberts, known for his stoicism, lifted his brow ever so slightly. A subtle gesture, but in this room of history and hierarchy, it was monumental. It was not a gesture of skepticism, nor of dismissal. It was a sign of something far rarer from the Chief Justice: acknowledgement, recognition, respect. The attorneys in the gallery exchanged quick, startled glances. Journalists scribbled furiously. Even Crockett's adversary faltered, his words momentarily caught in his throat, as though the weight of Roberts' reaction had stolen the certainty from his argument. The power dynamic shifted in an instant, where there had been arrogance and condescension. Now there was an unspoken awareness that Crockett's presence could not be ignored, her voice could not be diminished. She had entered this courtroom carrying not just her own dignity, but the weight of every story, every struggle, every barrier broken by those who came before her. And in that flicker of a raised brow, the nation watching saw it too. The respect she had earned in the most unforgiving of arenas. This was not the climax of her fight, but the spark that told everyone, supporters, critics, and undecideds alike, that something larger than a legal exchange was unfolding. Social media would later replay that moment frame by frame, zooming in on Roberts' reaction as if it were the telltale sign of history being made. Commentators would whisper about it, pundits would dissect it, and ordinary citizens would share. It is validation that truth and dignity can still pierce through arrogance. But in the chamber itself, the silence that followed spoke louder than any analysis could. Crockett had struck a chord no one expected, and the Chief Justice himself had, with a single expression, confirmed it. And yet, this was only the beginning, because what led to that jaw-dropping reaction would shake the entire courtroom. Shocked. Silence that followed Roberts' subtle acknowledgement carried more weight than the loudest gavel strike. It was the kind of silence that forces everyone in the room to confront what is truly at stake. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending a point of law, she was standing against an entire legacy of arrogance, the kind that drips from power when it believes it can never be challenged. Every dismissive smirk from her opponent, every patronizing tone, was meant to remind her of the hierarchy she was supposed to stay beneath. But Crockett was never one to bow her head. This was not simply a contest of intellect. It was a battle of identity. In Crockett's voice lived the stories of families who had crossed oceans and borders, of workers who had toiled in silence, of communities that had been told time and again that they were less American, less worthy, less human. The courtroom became a stage where dignity itself was on trial, and the entire nation, knowingly or not, had become the jury. Roberts' presence amplified the drama. As Chief Justice, he represented more than law. He symbolized the institution's authority, its capacity to confer legitimacy. When his brow rose even slightly, it was a gesture that signaled the gravity of Crockett's stand. She wasn't just answering arrogance. She was demanding that the highest seat of judgment see her, hear her, and respect her. And outside those marble walls, America was restless. Clips of Crockett's testimony were already trickling into feeds. People sitting in diners, scrolling between shifts, commuting on crowded trains, millions were witnessing not just a courtroom exchange, but a reflection of their own struggles. For them, her composure under fire was more than impressive. It was vindicating. Inside the chamber, tension thickened. The stakes were no longer confined to the outcome of a single case. They had grown into a question that stretched across the country. Could dignity and truth still triumph over arrogance and privilege? Could someone who carried the weight of marginalized voices still command the respect of America's most powerful courtroom? Every glance toward Roberts suggested the answer mattered far beyond those polished benches. Crockett knew this. It was written in the way she stood, shoulders squared not in defiance but in dignity. Her every word was deliberate, less about dismantling an argument than about affirming a principle that those who had been overlooked, underestimated, or erased would no longer whisper from the shadows. They would speak in the light, and just when the stakes couldn't get higher, the antagonist stepped in. He had entered the chamber with the kind of confidence that only long years of unchallenged authority could produce. His tailored suit was immaculate, his voice perfectly polished, his smile carrying that faint smirk which suggested he already believed the outcome was his. To him, Jasmine Crockett was not an equal adversary. She was an inconvenience, a momentary obstacle on the road to another easy victory. He leaned on the lectern as though it belonged to him, speaking with the condescending tone of a man convinced that the world had been built for his benefit, and everyone else was merely a guest. At the start, his strategy was not to debate ideas, but to belittle. He peppered his remarks with cutting asides, rolling his eyes when Crockett made a point, sighing dramatically as though her very presence in the courtroom tested his patience. To his allies in the gallery, these gestures seemed to reinforce the natural order. He, the seasoned power broker, and she, the intruder who should have known her place. Yet beneath his confidence lay contradictions that revealed themselves to anyone listening closely. He spoke of fairness but dismissed Crockett before she opened her mouth. He invoked patriotism, yet used it as a weapon to exclude. He praised the law as sacred but wielded it selectively, bending its meaning to reinforce privilege. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was systemic, an arrogance inherited from generations who believed the law was theirs to command, not a shield for the vulnerable. The more he spoke, the clearer the contrast became. His words dripped with elitism, every syllable carrying the assumption that Crockett's story, her identity, her background were liabilities rather than strengths. He called her arguments emotional while presenting his own rhetoric as the voice of reason, ignoring that his logic was stitched together by bias. He insisted on decorum even as his tone dripped with disdain. And with every attempt to diminish her, he revealed his fear that someone like her, someone who did not fit his vision of authority, might outshine him. For those watching, frustration simmered. His arrogance was a mirror of every boss who dismissed an idea without listening, every official who talked over community voices, every figure of power who had never been forced to check his privilege. The audience didn't just dislike him, they recognized him. They had met him in their own lives, and now they watched him in full display, condescending in real time. Roberts listened intently, his expression unreadable. But others in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance. The arrogance was so thick, so casual, that even those who might have sympathized with him before began to question his motives. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, dismissive, entitled, certain that the narrative of American law had no room for voices like Crockett's. And yet, arrogance has a way of blinding those who carry it. He didn't see the growing discomfort in the room. He didn't hear the sharp intake of breath from the audience when he brushed off Crockett's point with a smirk. He didn't notice Roberts's slight shift in posture, a sign that the Chief Justice was weighing more than just legal arguments. All he saw was himself, his history, his entitlement, his presumed superiority. That blindness would prove to be his downfall. Because what he didn't realize was that every word he used to diminish her only sharpened the contrast, setting the stage for the moment when Crockett would stand, unshaken, and return the fire with dignity. He believed he was writing her defeat, when in fact he was writing his own humiliation. But what they didn't realize was that Crockett had prepared for this moment all her life. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble chambers of justice or under the careful gaze of Chief Justice Roberts. It began far from the polished wood of courtrooms, in neighborhoods where resilience was not a choice but a necessity. She grew up surrounded by stories of struggle and sacrifice, raised in a community that knew the value of dignity because so often it had been denied to them. Hers was a childhood shaped by lessons that textbooks could not teach, that voices like hers were often silenced, and that silence itself was a kind of injustice. Her family carried with them the echoes of immigration and the weight of survival. They were not handed power. They earned every fragment of opportunity through sweat, perseverance, and an unshakable belief in possibility. Crockett watched her elders work long hours in jobs that demanded everything but offered little, and she absorbed the lesson that survival was not enough. To thrive, you had to demand recognition. You had to insist on being seen. Those memories forged the steel in her spine long before she ever stood before a judge. School was another battlefield. From a young age, she encountered the subtle dismissals, the lowered expectations, the unspoken assumption that she was reaching too high. Teachers praised her brilliance but cautioned her not to aim too far. Classmates mocked her ambition, reducing her dreams to naive fantasies. Yet every attempt to discourage her only hardened her resolve. She learned early how to carry herself with a calm exterior while inside, she was quietly storing every insult, every dismissal, as fuel for the future. When she chose law, it wasn't out of ambition for prestige. It was a calling. She had seen firsthand how the law could be used as a weapon against the vulnerable, but also how, in the right hands, it could be reclaimed as a shield. Her career was not built on climbing ladders of privilege. It was built on fighting for those whose voices had been ignored. She represented the unheard, the dismissed, the forgotten. Every client's story became another thread in the tapestry of her mission. Justice should not be ornamental, it should be lived. Service became her compass. Whether in community advocacy, public defense, or the broader halls of political life, Crockett refused to let her identity be reduced to a footnote. Instead, she carried it like a banner. She was unapologetically herself, a black woman, the daughter of struggle, a voice for immigrants and workers, a fighter who did not ask permission to belong. Her very presence in rooms dominated by privilege was itself an act of defiance, and she knew it. That knowledge never frightened her, it fueled her. The resilience she carried was not theoretical, it had been tested time and again. She endured the sting of being underestimated, the sneer of being called too emotional, the insinuation that her passion was somehow a weakness. But she also carried victories, the small triumphs in local courts, the grateful smiles of clients who had been heard for the first time, the community that saw in her not just an advocate, but a reflection of their own dignity. Each setback was a lesson. Each insult was another layer of armor. Each victory, no matter how small, was a promise to keep going. Crockett had learned how to transform pain into power, and that transformation became the essence of her character. She did not simply arrive in the courtroom as another lawyer. She arrived as the embodiment of a long and difficult journey, one that gave her not just the skills to argue, but the moral authority to stand. That day, facing arrogance in its purest form, Crockett stood not as an isolated figure, but as the culmination of all those struggles and all those stories. The weight of her identity, the sacrifices of her family, the battles of her community, all of it gave her presence a force that no amount of elitist dismissal could erase. To her opponent, she was just another lawyer to be belittled. To Roberts, and to the nation watching, she was something far greater. She was a reminder that justice is not handed down by those in power, but demanded by those who refuse to be silenced. And that's why, when the attack came, she didn't just respond, she rose above. The attack began the way arrogance always does, subtle at first, then sharpened into a weapon. The antagonist leaned forward, his tone dripping with false courtesy, each word wrapped in the kind of politeness that was meant to cut deeper than open insult. "With all due respect," he began, pausing just long enough to let the words hang heavy. "We must separate passion from reason, emotion from fact. Otherwise, this courtroom risks being reduced to mere theater." His allies smirked. The jab was clear. Crockett, in his framing, was nothing more than an actress, a woman mistaking conviction for logic. He gestured dismissively toward her papers, waving them off as though her evidence were the ramblings of someone unseasoned, unfit for the rigor of this arena. Every syllable was calculated to provoke, to unnerve, to strip her of composure in front of the one man whose opinion mattered most, Chief Justice Roberts. But Crockett did not flinch. She met his stare with the calm of someone who had been here before, who had faced dismissals so many times they no longer pierced her skin. Her silence unnerved him, forcing him to keep talking, to fill the space with increasingly desperate attempts to push her into error. He pressed harder. We cannot let sentiment cloud our interpretation of the law. If we do, we invite chaos. Order depends on discipline, not dramatics. And though Ms. Crockett presents herself eloquently, I question whether we are hearing a case or a performance. His voice rose now, riding on the approval of a few nods in the gallery. He wanted her rattled. He wanted Roberts convinced that she was overreaching, an interloper playing above her station. Yet Roberts did not move. His gaze lingered on Crockett, measuring, weighing. The antagonist didn't see it. He was too consumed with the performance of his own power, too eager to crush the rising force across from him. Crockett finally stirred, her hands resting lightly on the lectern. She inhaled slowly, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on him with an unblinking steadiness that unsettled even his allies. The silence stretched longer than expected, long enough for the tension in the room to coil tighter and tighter. This was no retreat, it was control. She was letting the weight of his words linger, exposing their hollowness by refusing to scramble for an immediate reply. Around them, the chamber grew restless. Some shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, sensing the storm that was about to break. Even Roberts adjusted, his chin tilting ever so slightly, as though preparing to witness something extraordinary. The antagonist scoffed, his voice cracking with impatience. "Is that all? Nothing to say?" His attempt at dominance betrayed a tremor, a nervous edge creeping into the corners of his confidence. Crockett's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, not amusement but recognition. She had seen this before, this pattern of men who mistook cruelty for strength, condescension for authority. She let the silence sharpen until it felt like the entire courtroom was hanging on her next breath. The room braced itself because her reply was about to flip the balance of power. The silence broke not with volume, but with precision. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm, deliberate, carrying the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to command a room. "Counsel," she began, her tone cutting through the chamber with the softness of steel. "You confuse dignity with theater because you have never had to fight to be heard." The words landed with the force of a hammer. A ripple passed through the courtroom, subtle but undeniable, as if the air itself had shifted. She did not rush. Every pause was intentional, every silence a stage upon which her opponent's arrogance was laid bare. She let him fidget, let him stew in the stillness that followed, before continuing. "You call my argument emotional. Yes, it is emotional, because justice is not an abstraction for the people I represent. It is the difference between belonging and exclusion, between having a future and being told you have none. What you dismiss as passion is lived reality. What you call performance is survival." The antagonist tried to interject, but Roberts raised a hand gently, silencing him without a word. The Chief Justice's gaze remained locked on Crockett, his eyes steady, his brow furrowed not in skepticism, but in attention. That tiny shift was monumental. The room understood it instantly. He was listening, truly listening. Crockett pressed on. "You warn against chaos, but chaos," she said, her voice tightening with clarity, "is what happens when power goes unchecked. Chaos is when arrogance silences truth, when privilege decides who counts as American and who does not. Order is not preserved by dismissing voices. It is preserved by hearing them. And if you cannot see that, then perhaps the law has always been theater for you, not for me." The chamber stirred. A few muffled gasps, the shuffle of papers, the sharp intake of breath from those who had not expected such unflinching resolve. Even those who had come to scoff found themselves sitting straighter, watching with a grudging respect they did not plan to give. Her rhythm built like music, rising and falling with deliberate control. My family worked this soil. My community paid taxes, served this country, and raised children who dreamed beyond the limitations set before them. And yet we are told, generation after generation, that our place is temporary, our claims conditional, our voices excessive. If that is theater, then this courtroom has been staging the same production for centuries. I stand here to close the curtain on it. The antagonist's smirk faltered. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward Roberts as though seeking rescue. But no rescue came. Roberts' face remained unreadable, save for the subtle narrowing of his eyes and the slight tilt of his chin, a signal to anyone watching closely that something profound was unfolding. Crockett slowed her cadence, letting the weight of her words settle. You tried to rattle me. You wanted me small, silent, apologetic, but I am none of those things. I stand on the shoulders of people who demanded dignity when none was offered. I speak not only for myself, but for every American who has been told their truth is too loud, their pride too dangerous, their love for this country somehow conditional. She paused, then delivered the line that sealed the moment. If that unsettles you, perhaps the problem is not my passion, but your fear.
The room erupted, not in applause, for the decorum of the court forbade it, but in energy, in the palpable electricity of recognition. Even in silence, the atmosphere vibrated with agreement, with the sense that history had just tilted. Crockett had not raised her voice once, but she had silenced arrogance more effectively than any shout could have. And then, almost imperceptibly, Roberts nodded. It was the smallest gesture, a measured dip of the headbutt in the context of this chamber. It was thunder, tacit acknowledgement, a rare, invisible sign of respect. For Roberts, whose reputation was built on restraint, it was equivalent to applause. The antagonist shifted uncomfortably, his papers trembling slightly in his hands. His carefully rehearsed superiority dissolved, exposed as fragile pretense in the face of Crockett's unshakable poise. He cleared his throat, tried to muster a rebuttal, but the words caught, weak and stumbling. The contrast was devastating. Where his bluster had once dominated, now it looked pitiful. Dwarfed by the composure of the woman he had sought to belittle, Crockett stood unbowed, her gaze steady, her presence undeniable. The silence after her words was not emptiness, was reverence, the kind of silence that acknowledges victory before the gavel strikes. Everyone in that chamber, from the seasoned journalists to the youngest clerk, knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The Chief Justice lowered his eyes to his notes, disguising the faintest trace of a smile. The gavel came down, but its sound carried a new weight, as if even the wood itself recognized the shift in balance. Crockett had not just defended her position, she had claimed respect, and Roberts had granted it in the most visible way he could. But what happened after? The gavel struck sent shock waves far beyond the courtroom. The gavel had barely struck before the moment escaped the confines of the courtroom and exploded into the wider world. Within minutes, clips of JasmineCrockett's.com, devastating counterattack, were ricocheting across social media. Someone in the gallery had captured the precise second Chief Justice Roberts noted a blink on you'll miss it gesture and slowed it down into a looping GIF. By the time the attorneys were gathering their papers, that GIF had already gone viral. The caption beneath it was simple, sharp, and irresistible. Respect recognized. On Twitter, hashtags began trending within the hour. Hashtag Crockett moment, hashtag dignity over arrogance, hashtag Roberts nods. Users flooded timelines with their reactions. Young woman in Los Angeles wrote, "I've never felt more seen in a courtroom clip. Jasmine Crockett speaks for us all." A father in Texas tweeted, "Watch this with my daughter." Told her that's what strength looks like. Memes blossomed overnight, comparing Crockett's poised silence to legendary mic drop moments in pop culture. Television pundits seized the story with predictable frenzy. One anchor replayed the exchange frame by frame, dissecting every syllable of Crockett's takedown and every twitch of the antagonist's crumbling expression. Another host, clearly reveling in the drama, declared this wasn't just a legal argument, it was a cultural reset. Even networks that had often downplayed her importance could not resist the spectacle. They showed the clip on loop, each replay magnifying the sense that the moment carried meaning far beyond the case at hand. Celebrities joined in. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just gave the performance of a lifetime, except it wasn't a performance, it was truth." An NBA star posted the Roberts GIF with the caption, "Game recognized game." Activists shared it as a rallying cry. Organizers framed it as proof that persistence pays off. And comedians added their spin with sketches mocking the antagonists. Flustered collapse. But it wasn't just the famous or the loudest voices who gave the moment weight. It was the everyday citizens who saw themselves in Crockett. Teachers wrote about showing the clip in classrooms. Students debated it in cafeterias. Workers on night shifts shared it during breaks, marveling at how dignity could cut through arrogance with such surgical precision. For them, Crockett's composure wasn't abstract, it was personal validation, a reminder that calm strength can triumph even when the odds feel insurmountable. Not everyone praised her, of course. Critics scrambled to downplay the impact, labeling it grandstanding or emotional pandering. Yet their words rang hollow against the flood of admiration pouring in from across the country. Each attempt to diminish her only fueled the virality. Every attack was met with thousands of replies, memes, and rebuttals reminding them of the undeniable. Crockett had commanded the room, and Roberts had acknowledged it. The ripple effects reached even those who had not been paying close attention to the case. Suddenly, people who rarely followed courtroom debates were sharing the clip at dinner tables, sending it to friends, discussing it in group chats. It had become more than politics. It was a cultural story, the kind that lingers long after headlines fade. In the days that followed, Crockett's name became synonymous with resilience. Commentators called her a rising star. Editorials framed her as the embodiment of the struggle for dignity in American democracy. But perhaps the most powerful impact was quieter, more intimate, the way ordinary people spoke her name with pride, as though her victory belonged to them too. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. In the end, the courtroom confrontation was not simply about one exchange, one nod, or one gavel strike. It was about what those moments represented. Jasmine Crockett's composure had transformed arrogance into silence. And in doing so, she reminded the nation that dignity is stronger than dismissal, that truth is sharper than intimidation, and that respect is not given, is earned, claimed, and sometimes wrestled from those who never intended to grant it. Chief Justice Roberts' nod carried more weight than volumes of legal text. It was a gesture that said, without words, that the calm force of authenticity could command authority. For many watching, Scott's single moment of respect symbolized something larger, the acknowledgement of voices long pushed to the margins. The recognition that legitimacy does not belong only to the powerful, but to the principled. Crockett's response reframed the battlefield. The antagonist had relied on condescension, the old tools of arrogance and dismissal. But arrogance always underestimates. It assumes silence is weakness, passion is chaos, and identity is baggage. Crockett showed the opposite. Silence can be power, passion can be discipline, and identity can be the very foundation of strength. Her triumph was not only personal, it was generational. This is the moral arc of her story, that justice is not preserved by those who cling to power, but by those who dare to speak when silence is demanded of them. Her victory was not measured in applause, but in resonance, in the millions who saw themselves reflected in her dignity. The lesson was clear true. Authority comes not from belittling others, but from uplifting truth even when the room is hostile. For the audience who lived this moment alongside her, the inspiration was unmistakable. They were reminded that resilience is not abstract, it is forged in everyday battles, in the worker dismissed by a boss, the student underestimated by a teacher, the immigrant told they don't belong. Crockett's reply became a symbol for each of them, proof that standing firm in one's truth can dismantle the arrogance of those who believe themselves untouchable. The crescendo of this story is not simply Crockett's victory over her antagonist, it is the realization that the fight for dignity is shared. The respect she won in that chamber was respect claimed on behalf of everyone told to lower their voice, to shrink, to apologize for